Good afternoon and welcome to the Small Grain Summary and Grain Stocks Briefings. My name is Joe Parsons. I serve as Chair of the Agricultural Statistics Board here at NASS. This briefing is for the Secretary of Agriculture and other policymakers at USDA to better understand the content and context of today's reports. We're pleased to have Dr. Cindy Nickerson, USDA's Deputy Chief Economist, with us today as our Secretary Designate. Welcome. Dr. Nickerson, I'd like to share that Bianca Perneda of our Pacific Northwest office and Kevin Lamans of our Southern Region office both provided valuable assistance on the preparation of these reports. I want to thank both of them for their valuable assistance. I have a few notes for our live streaming audience. The Small Grains and Grain Stocks reports are principal federal economic indicator reports. The Office of Management and Budget provides specific guidance on how these important reports are to be released. 1B statistical policy instructs policymaking officials to refrain from making public comment within 1 hour of the release of these reports. We will not be taking questions during this briefing from the public. However, NASS staff are available for email or phone questions, and we will host a social media event 1 hour after the release of these data. We strive to have all of everything presented at this briefing match the official record. However, should there be any discrepancy between what is presented at this briefing and the published estimates, always refer to the official published estimates. With that, I'm going to turn it over to Mr. Lance Honig, Chief of the NASS Crops Range. Lance?
All right, thank you, Joe. Good afternoon. Welcome. A lot of information to share with you as usual today, so we'll jump right in. Before we talk about the numbers, though, just a couple of things I want to point out. First of all, as is our normal practice, this is the end of the marketing season for corn and soybeans, so we also had the opportunity to review our previous year production for those two crops. We did make some, I'd say, fairly minor revisions. You can see them outlined on the note on the screen here, and also this box appears on the front of the grain stocks report, alerting folks to that fact, because that's where that information is published today. And I'll talk a little bit more in detail about those revisions when we get a little bit further into the presentation. And then the second thing I'll point out is just some of the information that we utilize preparing for these reports today. From a survey perspective, first of all, our farmer survey, the September Ag Survey is what we would call it this month. You can see just over 56,000 producers were contacted from August 30th through September 17th. And of course, the primary objective there is to collect the final acreage yield and production information for the small grain crops, and then of course to collect the on-farm portion of the grains and oil seeds for the grain stocks report. In addition to that, we have our off-farm grain stocks survey, of course, to measure the off-farm portion of the stocks. Similar data collection time frame there. Just a reminder, there's about 8,200 of those facilities across the U.S. And of course, since winter wheat's included in the report today, we do have our final objective yield information as well. 1,155 samples this season. Of course, that's all final information as well. And then last but not least, both the FSA and RMA data are critical to our process at the end of the season as well. And so they were heavily utilized in finalizing these numbers for the small grain crops today. This next graphic just highlights the sample sizes by state for the September Ag Survey. Again, just to give you a glimpse of how those samples are distributed across the country. So with that said, let's go ahead and jump into the numbers. We'll talk about the acreage yield and production for the small grains first. So we'll open with winter wheat. Planted area for 2022, 33.3 million acres. That's down 2.2%, or 735,000 acres from what we had previously estimated. The FSA certified acres, of course, a big driver behind the change there. Overall, down 1.2% from what was planted last season. Final harvested area, 23.5 million acres. That's down 6.2% from the August forecast, 7.9% below what was harvested last year. Our final yield is 47 bushels per acre. That's down 1.9%, or 0.9 of a bushel from the August forecast. 6.4%, or 3.2 bushels below last year's final yield. So as you can see, our final winter wheat production for 2022 totaling just over 1.1 billion bushels, 13.6% below what was produced last season. A big part of the story this year with winter wheat was the abandonment, higher than normal abandonment. On this next graphic, you can see the planted and harvested acres for the recent seasons. And of course, that big gap this year between the orange planted line and the gold harvested line indicating that higher abandonment. In fact, if you look at that harvested to planted ratio this year, it is the lowest since 1933. In Texas in particular, it's the lowest on record, just 24.5% in Texas, 4 million acres not harvested for grain in Texas this year, but really the issues there extending out of Texas, they just were probably the most severely impacted, but all of the areas in the central and southern plains and westward due to those dry conditions this season, leading to that higher abandonment. The next graphic just highlights the winter wheat yields over the last 30 seasons. You can see the trend line plotted in there as well. This is the lowest yield since 2015. It's the third consecutive year of declining yields, and as you can see on the graphic, falling well below trend this season. The first data map that I have for you today just highlights the winter wheat yields by state and a comparison to last year. So the way this map is laid out, the top number is the final yield for each state. The lower number represents the percent change from the previous season. All the states colored in any shade of red are below last year's yield. Those in blue are above. And of course, the deeper the color, the larger the change. Anytime you see a pound sign, it indicates a record high. We did actually have record high yields this year in Illinois, New Jersey, North Dakota, and Tennessee. But as I mentioned earlier, you see the deep red colors extending from Texas up through Nebraska and westward, reflecting those extreme dry conditions this year. Looking to the north, the Dakotas and westward there, that's probably more a reflection of a rebound from the dry conditions last season. This next graphic highlights some information from our winter wheat objective yield survey. What you see on this graphic, each of those vertical bars represents the number of heads per square foot as measured by the objective yield survey. The red dots indicate the final published yield for that 10-state region. And so again, you can see this season story. Lower head population than we had seen in the previous 3 seasons. And then as you can see, the season went on, that implied head weight as you watch the dots drop, indicating what was happening with the crop this year. This next graphic just highlights the final winter wheat production totals over the recent years as well. Not enough data here to show you when it was this low previously, because the last time it was that low was back in 1970. And this next graphic highlights a comparison between the published expectations and our estimate of final winter wheat production today. Each of the blue dots representing an individual industry member's published expectation, the red blocks indicating the NASS estimates in there. Of course, as you can see with that red block well below expectations, I imagine that is largely due to the big decrease in acreage compared to our recent forecast. But as I mentioned, largely reflecting an analysis of the certified acreage data from FSA. Next, we'll move on to other spring wheat. Planted area here, 10.8 million acres. That's down 2.5%, or just 275,000 acres from the previous estimate, 5.1% below last year. Harvested area, 10.4 million acres, is down 2.5% from the previous forecast, but still up 2.8% from what was harvested last season. Our final yield of 46.2 bushels per acre, down just 3.3% or 1.6 bushels per acre from that August forecast. But the big story there is the huge increase from last year's drought devastated crop through much of the growing area there. In fact, that's a 13.6 bushel increase year over year. So our final production for other spring wheat, 482 million bushels, down 5.8% from August, but still 45.7% more than was produced last season. On this next graphic, just looking at the planted and harvested acres over recent years here, kind of the opposite story of what we talked about with winter wheat. Last year was a big drought for the other spring wheat, so we're rebounding back to a more normal harvested to planted ratio. This season, the bigger story would be the fact that it's the 4th consecutive year of declining planted area, and therefore obviously leading to lower production through that time period. Next, we'll take a look at the other spring wheat yields over the last 30 seasons and how they compare with trend. Again, very clearly a big rebound from last year's challenges. Still a little bit below trend, but getting pretty close to being back up there this season. Next, we'll take a look at those other spring wheat yields by state and how they compare with last year. All deep blue on the map here because, again, the big rebounds across the board. You do see a pound sign in North Dakota, so actually reported a record high yield for other spring wheat in North Dakota this season. Just taking a quick look at the production over the recent seasons here, you can see, again, same story, just a bounce back from last season, but still below the previous 3 years due to that declining acreage. Next, we'll take a look at a comparison between the spring wheat production estimate published today and those pre-report published expectations. You can see, again, a little bit below the range there, but not a big gap in terms of bushels between the expectations and the estimate today. Moving on to Durum, planted area 1.63 million acres. That's down 13%, or 244,000 acres from the previous estimate, down just 10,000 acres from what was actually planted last year. 1.58 million acres harvested this season. It's down 13.1% from what we had previously forecast, but still up 3.6% from last season. Our final yield at 40.5 bushels per acre, very similar to our last forecast, and of course the big increase from last year, as we've talked about with the other spring wheat as well. Final production therefore totaling just under 64 million bushels, 13% below August, but nearly 70% more than was produced last season. Looking at the acreage for Durum wheat, not much of a big story here. You can see the planted area pretty consistent the last 3 seasons now. And again, a bit of a bounce back from some challenges last year on the harvested side. Similar story for the yield. In fact, for Durum, you can see actually bouncing back to just above trend this year. Taking a look at the Durum wheat yields by state and how they compare with last year. Of course, Montana and North Dakota, by far the leading producing states. You can see big increases in yield this year following last year's drought conditions, really driving the change that's happening nationally this season. In fact, in North Dakota, I mentioned the record high spring wheat yield. Here we're looking at the 3rd highest Durum wheat yield on record in North Dakota. Just to give you a quick glimpse of how that production total this season compares with the recent seasons, not a major story. Taking again a quick look at how the final production numbers for Durum compare with the expectations. Kind of continuing that trend, you can see the estimate a little bit lower than folks were expecting today. But again, this would be an acreage-driven reduction compared to what we had previously published, and that was probably something not anticipated by those out in the industry. Moving on to the other small grain crops that we're finalizing today, barley. You can see we reduced planted area 2.7% from our previous estimate, but still 8.8% above last year. Big rebound on the harvested side, like we've seen with the other small grain crops, particularly those grown up in the north, year over year, more than 22% increase there. Our final yield for barley, 71.7 bushels per acre. That's up from both August and from last season, putting our final production at 174 million bushels, again, up from the previous forecast and last season. Looking at barley, we have our highest planted and harvested acreage since 2016. And again, like the other small grain crops, the story there, just a rebound from last year's challenges. Oats, you can see increases across the board on planted and harvested area, both from August and from last season. The story there is very much the same as what we talked about with the other crops. Final yield at 64.8 bushels per acre, leading to a production total of 57.7 million bushels, 44.7% above what was produced last year. And looking at rye, 2.18 million acres planted, just slightly up from what we had previously estimated. But of course, with rye, most of that not harvested for grain. So you can see just 341,000 acres harvested this season, down slightly from what we estimated back in June, but still 16% more than was harvested last year. Our final yield at 36.1 bushels per acre is up from last year. So overall production at 12.3 million bushels, up 25.4% year over year. I should point out 36.1 bushel per acre yield is a record high. Just to give you a quick update on where things stood with harvest when we conducted our September ag survey. This graphic just shows the percent of the acres that were still left to be harvested at the time of the interview. You can see the gold bar to the right indicating 2022 numbers compared to the recent 3 seasons. A little bit higher than, I guess I would say, average, not as low as we saw back in 2019 with the major problems there. In some cases, fairly similar to what we saw 2 seasons ago. But overall, it's just a little bit slow start in carrying through harvest, but really haven't heard anything about any harvest issues. So I imagine they've wrapped up by now. Next, we'll transition things over to the grain stocks report. We'll start things off with all wheat. Of course, this is our beginning stocks for the all wheat. See that total for September 1.78 billion bushels, up just 0.1% from a year earlier. The on-farm stocks up 41% year over year, while the off-farm stocks are down 12.5% year over year. That total for September 1 is the second lowest since 2007. Last year would have been the lowest since 2007, and we're pretty much right in line with where we were a year ago. Taking a closer look at the all wheat stocks, the way this graphic is laid out, each of the vertical bars represents the beginning supply for each of those seasons. You see the 4 horizontal lines for the 4 quarterly stocks estimates, and as I mentioned, beginning stocks this quarter. That green September line shows you that 1.78 billion bushel total. The 2.32 billion bushel beginning supply is down 6.9% from the previous season. And looking at the June to August disappearance, 543 million bushels. That's off 24.4% from the same period a year earlier. Taking a look at how the all wheat stocks estimate compares with published expectations. Here you can see the red block pretty much right in the middle of those expectations. So no big surprise with the all wheat stocks total today. Next, we'll move on to corn. As I mentioned earlier on, this represents the ending stocks for corn. And so you can see as of September 1, that ending stocks total 1.38 billion bushels. That's up 11.5% from a year earlier. On-farm stocks up 29% year over year. Off-farm stocks up just 3.3% from the same time a year earlier. And as we take a closer look at those stocks over time, here you can see the 16.3 billion bushel beginning supply is up 1.7% from the previous season, and our June to August disappearance of 2.97 billion bushels is up 3.2% from the same time period a year earlier. Looking at how that compares with the published expectations, you can see again falling a bit lower than what folks were expecting today. Now, a couple of things I'll point out here. First of all, as a reminder, because the marketing season is complete, we do have the opportunity to go back and review the previous season's production totals, and that's what we did. So we've got a balance sheet here just to kind of illustrate some points here. I will point out we do have a couple of typos in here. This ending stocks number right here, that is not correct. That is not what the WASDE was carrying last month, as indicated by the asterisk. They were actually carrying a 1.525. That's actually the previous season's ending stocks number that slipped in there on us, driving some of the resulting calculations a little bit off. So I'll try to talk you through what's happening here. But again, anytime you see an asterisk next to a number on here, that indicates that we've simply just carried forward what was published in the WASDE last month. And that's the assumption that we're making for those items that the WASDE will pick up next month as well. And so just to point out that production change right here, you can see down 41 million bushels to the previous year's crop. Planted area for corn last season, we revised down 105,000 acres. That's just 0.1%. Harvested area for grain down 70,000 acres, again, just 0.1%. Yield, we revised down 0.3 bushel. And so overall, that's what brought us to the 41.4 million bushel reduction on the production side. That represents about 0.3% change on the production. So not a major shift there. Next, we'll move on to soybean stocks. Again, like corn, this represents ending stock. So as of September 1, 273.8 million bushels. That's up 6.5% from the same time last year. On-farm stocks down 7.6%, but the off-farm stocks up 11.6% year over year. Looking ahead again at the chart showing what's happening with soybeans across the season, turning our attention to that green line at the bottom. You can see the total that I just mentioned. That does represent the second lowest ending stock since the 15-16 season. Our beginning supply, though, was the third highest on record at 4.72 billion bushels, even though it was down slightly from the previous season. And our June to August disappearance for soybeans, 698 million bushels. That was up 36.2% from the same time a year earlier. Looking at how the soybean stock estimate compares with the published expectations here, you can see a little bit higher than folks were expecting. So maybe a little bit of a surprise there today as well. And then similar to what I showed you for corn, again, we reviewed the balance sheet now that the marketing season is complete. And like corn, we did make some minor revisions to the previous season's production. This table laid out just like the one I showed you for corn. And so again, any of the numbers with the asterisks next to them indicate that that is simply carried in from the most recent WASDE report. And so again, the change that I would talk about here, as you can see, we actually revised our 2021 soybean production up 30.2 million bushels. No change to the planted acreage, harvested acreage down just 20,000 acres, a minor tweak there. But the yield was increased 0.3 of a bushel, accounting for that 30 million bushel increase in production. And as you can kind of glean from looking at the balance sheet here, obviously the adjustment there was largely to net us a positive residual at the end of the season, which obviously is typically the goal. I would point out this season, if realized, we're looking at the highest crushing on record for soybeans and looking at the second highest exports and disappearance behind just last year. So with that said, we've got just a few other crops included in the stocks report today as well. Barley stocks, you can see up 22.2% year over year. That's actually the highest September 1 on-farm stock since 2016. You see the 56% increase there. Off-farm stocks down 23.3%. For barley, that's actually a record low off-farm total. So nearly the highest on-farm, record low off-farm. Durum wheat, you can see the total there is up 17.2% year over year, 50% increase in the on-farm stocks, 10.4% reduction in the off-farm portion. Overall, though, that total durum stocks is the second lowest September 1 stocks on record. Obviously, it's up from last year, so you know last year was the record low. We're just second lowest now. Oats up just slightly from what was stored at the same time a year earlier. Again, fairly sharp increase in the on-farm storage, big decrease in the off-farm portion. Moving on to sorghum, huge increase there year over year. In fact, that's the highest September 1 sorghum stocks total since 2019. That's all triggering off a large production from that previous season. And then last but not least, looking at the sunflower stocks, down 25.3% from a year earlier, down on both the on and off-farm portions stored at this time. The next slide I have for you just highlights some of the upcoming reports over the next month or so. You can see, of course, coming up on the 3rd, care reports, crop production and cotton ginnings coming back around pretty quickly here on October the 12th. Cattle on feed, cotton ginnings, and rice stocks later in October, and then, of course, the ag prices at the end of October. One last reminder for you here just shortly at 1 o'clock Eastern, I will be out on Twitter hosting our regular Stat Chat event to see what kind of questions folks might have about today's reports. And that is the last slide that I have for you, so I'd like to thank you for joining us today. Thanks to all the folks out watching the live stream today as well, but that's going to wrap things up for us here. And so we look forward to seeing everybody.